loved his family and loved serving this state and our country. He dedicated his life to our country.
He spent nearly a quarter century in the United States Senate, sat across from presidents, questioned Supreme Court nominees, and stood in war zones from Baghdad to Kiev. But for almost 50 years, one question followed Lindsey Graham everywhere he went, into every campaign stop, every talk show couch, every awkward pause in an interview. Why did he never marry? He always answered with a joke. He talked about a rotating first lady, about bad timing, about never meeting the right woman. Reporters laughed. Voters laughed. And then, in July 2026, Lindsey Graham died suddenly at 71, and the joke stopped being funny. Within days, the woman who actually knew the answer, his only sibling, a woman most Americans had never heard of until that week, stepped forward and told the real story. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a secret romance gone wrong. It was something far simpler and far heavier, a promise made by a 22-year-old to a terrified 13-year-old, standing in a living room in Seneca, South Carolina, on the worst day of both their lives. To understand that promise, you have to go back to where it started, decades before Lindsey Graham ever set foot in Washington. He was born on July 9, 1955, in Central, South Carolina, a small mill town where his parents ran a bar, pool hall, and liquor store to make ends meet. The family lived behind the business, in cramped rooms above and beside the noise of the pool hall downstairs. It was not a glamorous childhood. Graham grew up working the counter, restocking shelves, learning the rhythms of a working-class southern town where everybody knew everybody and nobody had much to spare. He was the first person in his family to go to college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina with plans that, at the time, had nothing to do with elected office. Those plans were about to be interrupted in a way no 20-year-old is prepared for. In 1976, when Graham was in his early 20s, his mother died of Hodgkin lymphoma. He spent nearly a quarter century in the United States Senate, sat across from presidents, questioned Supreme Court nominees, and stood in war zones from Baghdad to Kiev. But for almost 50 years, one question followed Lindsey Graham everywhere he went, into every campaign stop, every talk show couch, every awkward pause in an interview. Why did he never marry? He always answered with a joke. He talked about a rotating first lady, about bad timing, about never meeting the right woman. Reporters laughed. Voters laughed. And then, in July 2026, Lindsey Graham died suddenly at 71, and the joke stopped being funny. Within days, the woman who actually knew the answer, his only sibling, a woman most Americans had never heard of until that week, stepped forward and told the real story. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a secret romance gone wrong. It was something far simpler and far heavier, a promise made by a 22-year-old to a terrified 13-year-old, standing in a living room in Seneca, South Carolina, on the worst day of both their lives. To understand that promise, you have to go back to where it started, decades before Lindsey Graham ever set foot in Washington. He was born on July 9, 1955, in Central, South Carolina, a small mill town where his parents ran a bar, pool hall, and liquor store to make ends meet. The family lived behind the business, in cramped rooms above and beside the noise of the pool hall downstairs. It was not a glamorous childhood. Graham grew up working the counter, restocking shelves, learning the rhythms of a working-class southern town where everybody knew everybody and nobody had much to spare. He was the first person in his family to go to college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina with plans that, at the time, had nothing to do with elected office. Those plans were about to be interrupted in a way no 20-year-old is prepared for. In 1976, when Graham was in his early 20s, his mother died of Hodgkin lymphoma. 15 months later, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. In the space of little more than a year, Graham went from being a college student worrying about exams to being the only adult his younger sister had left in the world. Darlene was 13. She has since described standing in the living room of their house, terrified, when her brother wrapped his arms around her and told her he would always take care of her. It's the kind of line that sounds like something out of a movie, except it wasn't a line. It was a promise he spent the rest of his life keeping. There was no trust fund, no distant wealthy relative ready to swoop in, no family estate to fall back on. There was a grieving college student and a grieving teenager, and a decision that would quietly define everything that came after. Rather than send Darlene off to live with relatives full-time, Graham stepped into the role of guardian. He kept close tabs on her even while he was finishing his degree and later attending law school, making the drive back and forth between Columbia, where he was studying, and the area near Seneca, where relatives were helping look after her day to day. When he later joined the Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps as a young military lawyer, he took the extraordinary step of formally adopting his own sister, not out of sentiment alone, but so that she would legally qualify as his dependent and be covered under his military benefits. It was a practical decision wrapped around an emotional one. He was making sure that if anything ever happened to him, she would still be protected. By his sister's own account, he took the job seriously in a way that went well beyond paperwork. She has talked about how strict he was during her teenage years, how he'd come home on leave and check up on her the way an overprotective parent would, making sure she was staying in line, keeping her grades up, staying out of trouble. It was an unusual life for a man in his 20s. While his peers were dating, building careers, thinking about starting families of their own, Graham was driving hours to check on a teenager's report card and worrying about whether she had everything she needed for school. Friends from that period have said the loss of both parents forced him to grow up almost overnight, trading the normal concerns of a young law student for something closer to single parenthood. That responsibility didn't end when Darlene grew up. It became the emotional foundation of Graham's entire adult life. He went on to build a legal and military career that spanned 33 years of total Air Force service, including time as a military prosecutor and defense attorney stationed in Germany. He moved into local politics in South Carolina, working as an assistant county attorney and then as city attorney for his own hometown of Central, before winning a seat in the state legislature in 1992. From there his rise was fast, the U.S. House of Representatives in 1994, and then, in 2002, the United States Senate, where he succeeded the long-serving Strom Thurmond and would go on to win re-election multiple times over the next 2 decades. In Washington, Graham became known for 2 things that don't usually go together: a hawkish, often unyielding stance on national security, and an unusual willingness to work across the aisle when he thought it might actually produce results. Much of that reputation was built alongside his close friend, Senator John McCain of Arizona. Along with Senator Joe Lieberman, the two became known around the Capitol as the Three Amigos, a nickname that stuck because of how often they traveled and voted together on defense and foreign policy matters. Their friendship was one of the defining relationships of Graham's political life. When McCain was diagnosed with brain cancer in 2017, it was Graham who first shared the news with fellow senators after speaking to him directly. When McCain died in 2018, Graham stayed close to the family for years afterward, a bond that McCain's own daughter would later describe warmly, saying that Graham had become something like an extension of their own family, someone who kept showing up long after the cameras and official obligations had faded away. Graham's legislative record reflected that same instinct toward negotiation, for better or worse depending on who you asked. He became one of the most visible Republican voices on immigration reform, working with the late Senator Ted Kennedy in the mid-2000s on a comprehensive overhaul that tried to combine tighter border security with a pathway to legal status for undocumented immigrants already living in the country. It was ambitious, and it drew fire from conservative activists who argued that any legal pathway amounted to amnesty, no matter what conditions were attached. Graham pushed back on that framing every time, arguing that border security and an orderly immigration system weren't opposing goals but complementary ones. Years later, he tried again as part of the Senate's bipartisan Gang of Eight, helping craft a 2013 immigration bill that passed the Senate with support from both parties before stalling out in the House. It never became law, but it cemented his reputation, again, as someone willing to negotiate even when it cost him politically. On foreign policy, Graham was consistent in a way few senators managed to be over multiple decades. Drawing on his own background as an Air Force lawyer, he became one of the chamber's most reliable national security hawks, a strong believer in American military leadership abroad as a stabilizing force. He didn't just talk about these issues from Washington. He made repeated trips overseas during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to meet directly with troops, diplomats, and allied leaders. That same instinct carried him to Ukraine multiple times after Russia's 2022 invasion, where he met with government officials and argued publicly that supporting Ukraine wasn't charity, it was a strategic investment in international stability. Supporters saw a consistent, experienced voice on national security. Critics thought he leaned too readily toward military intervention. Either way, his positions rarely wavered over the course of his career. His political identity did shift in one major way over time. During the 2016 Republican primary, Graham was one of Donald Trump's sharpest critics within the party, at one point calling out Trump's proposed ban on Muslims entering the country in blunt terms, a comment that led Trump to publicly share Graham's personal phone number at a campaign rally. But in the years after McCain's death in 2018, Graham gradually became one of Trump's most influential allies in the Senate, a transformation that reshaped how much of the public saw him almost as thoroughly as his private family story, once it finally became public, would reshape how people understood his personal life. He went on to chair the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2021, playing a central role in confirming a long list of federal judges, and later chaired the Senate Budget Committee starting in 2025. Through all of it, one thing never changed. Graham never married, and he never had children of his own. It became a running subplot of his public life, especially during his brief run for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination, when reporters repeatedly asked who would serve as First Lady if he somehow won. He always deflected with humor, joking about a rotating cast of women who might fill in for the role. It made for good headlines and an easy laugh line at rallies. What almost nobody outside his inner circle understood at the time was that the joke was covering for something real. In his own memoir, Graham once wrote that he chalked up his single life to timing, to never quite finding the right moment or the right person. But he also wrote something that got far less attention, that despite never marrying, he considered himself a man with a family all the same. That family, it turns out, was his sister. Lindsey Graham died on July 11, 2026, at the age of 71. His office described the cause as a brief and sudden illness, and the news broke early the next morning, sending shockwaves through Washington just weeks after he had won his primary and appeared headed toward a comfortable path to a fifth Senate term. Tributes came in almost immediately from across the political spectrum. Colleagues who had disagreed with him for years still spoke of his energy, his accessibility, his willingness to sit down with almost anyone. Members of the McCain family spoke of losing someone they had come to think of as one of their own. And within days, attention turned to the person who had rarely stood at the microphone beside him but who, it turned out, had shaped almost everything about who he was, his sister, Darlene Graham Nordun. Now a mother of two who has spent her career helping people with disabilities find employment, Darlene had spent decades staying largely out of the spotlight, appearing occasionally in campaign ads or standing quietly behind her brother at big moments, like his 2015 presidential campaign announcement back in their hometown, where the two of them stopped by their parents' graves before he even took the stage. But after his death, she became, almost overnight, the person best positioned to explain who Lindsey Graham really was underneath the jokes and the headlines. She has described a brother who simply decided, as a very young man, that raising her mattered more than anything else he could have built for himself, including a family of his own in the traditional sense. She has talked about how he made her a promise the day their father died and never once treated keeping that promise as some kind of burden or sacrifice. He just did it, for the rest of his life, without complaint, and without ever making it the centerpiece of a campaign speech, even though it was arguably the most defining decision of his entire life. In the days after his death, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster made the decision to appoint Darlene Graham Nordun to serve out the remainder of her brother's Senate term, making her the first woman ever to represent South Carolina in the United States Senate. Announcing the choice, the governor pointed directly to the bond between the two siblings, framing her appointment as a tribute to the way Graham had spent his life taking care of the person who mattered most to him. President Trump publicly backed the pick as well, calling it a fitting way to honor his longtime ally. For Darlene, the moment closed a kind of circle that had begun more than 50 years earlier in the rooms behind a small-town bar in central South Carolina, when a 22-year-old college student made a promise to a scared 13-year-old that he would always take care of her. She kept her word about returning the favor, telling reporters after taking the oath of office that her brother had always been there for her, and that she intended to be there for the people he had represented, the same way he had once been there for her. What her account reveals, in the end, is not some hidden scandal or a secret relationship kept out of public view. It's something quieter and, in a lot of ways, more affecting than that. Lindsey Graham never married because, in the most literal sense, he had already built a family decades earlier, on the day he chose to raise his little sister instead of letting her be passed along to whichever relative had room. Every joke about a rotating first lady, every deflection in a campaign interview, sat on top of that one decision made in a living room in 1976, a promise that outlasted every headline written about him and that only became fully known to the country after he was gone. If this story moved you, that's because it's a reminder that the biggest things about a person's life aren't always the things that make the news. Sometimes they're quieter than that, kept between two people for 50 years, and only understood in full once someone finally